Hello, everyone, and welcome to War and Literature. I hope everyone had a good reading break and are ready to get back and crack the books, so to speak, for the second half of our course. So the first half of the course, we studied two ancient authors. We studied Homer and Virgil. In the second half of the course, we're going to be studying authors of the modern era. So modern in a broad sense of the last 500 years, 1500 to the present, William Shakespeare and Virginia Woolf. But tonight, rather than to dive right into that, I wanted to take some time and go over expectations and things to keep in mind as you prepare for the third assignment, which is the research essay. So what I'd like to do is I'll call up a couple documents here. We'll start with the syllabus that will, so we can remind ourselves the description of this assignment, the third assignment. So it's due March 25th. And it's to be 1,200 words long, give or take 100 words, which is probably around 4 to 5 pages, double spaced. And it's a research essay, which means in this case, you're going to be asked to engage with at least the arguments of 3 secondary reference works. So peer-reviewed articles, a chapter in a book, those types of things. And you'll be asked to, of course, post the essay as a Word or PDF file on the assignment section of the course on Brightspace. So if you go into Brightspace, the top right, there's an assignment tab. Okay, so you hit the assignment tab, and then you'll see the different assignments, 2 of which you've already done. Assignment number 3, click there, and then you'll be given options for uploading a file. So that part's fairly straightforward, and you've probably done it for other classes. So there's a few tools I want to point out to you just right now. If you look at nothing else, there's a few tools right here in the syllabus. So there's this link here goes to the essay writing tips subsite of my webpage that has some general tips in terms of the process of writing. That I won't go through all those tips, but just some high-level tips for the process of writing. And at the bottom of that page, there are some sample essays from previous courses that I've taught that I thought were okay, so I put them on there. There are also a couple of documents that we're going to go through tonight. So the first one is about the research process, the research and thinking process. And then the other is this more about the actual construction of the essay per se, elements of an excellent academic essay. There's also this style guide. I won't go through that, but this will be helpful for issues such as grammar, citation style, those types of things. So one question I often get is, do I have to use MLA citation style? So I'm not a stickler for the style as long as it's consistent and clear, okay? So if you're a psychology major and want to use the APA method there, that's fine, as long as it's clear and consistent. Or if you're in, I think history often uses the Chicago manual style, if I'm correct, and go ahead. And as I said, as long as it's clear. The style guide linked here from the Department of English uses the MLA style guide, and it's kind of a short form of that. And it also talks about different grammar and sentence construction tips. So those are some style guides. Those are some tools that you have at your disposal. And we'll talk a bit about, obviously, others as we go along. So right now, while we're here, I'd like to go over the topics. So the topics that are here, and these are meant as suggestions, they're broad suggestions. And you're welcome to depart from them slightly. Let me know if you're going to depart from them quite a bit, because just so that we can make sure that you're going down a good path in terms of being able to craft a good thesis there. And they're fairly broad so that you can try to make it your own and dive in there. So you don't have to actually state your essay exactly as worded here, but it gives you a general sense of a topic that you can go in, dive in, and create a thesis. And we'll talk about what a thesis is, make sure we're all on the same page on that. So topic one that I'm suggesting here is, does Shakespeare represent Henry V as a great military leader? So there's a lot of different angles you could take on that. What are the different depictions of his ability to rouse the troops, those types of things? What are we to take away from some of the speeches? Are we to see him as a great military leader or merely a tyrant? So there's a lot of different areas you could, or let's say different directions. So how does Shakespeare's play Henry V present war? Is there an ultimate meaning or significance one can draw from war in terms of individual or national glory, or is it ultimately meaningless? So again, a pretty big topic. You want to, again, narrow that down. Okay, I'm going to talk about how it's portrayed in these scenes and what Shakespeare seems to be saying about the nature of war, what it means in this particular aspect of the plot or the action. What is the function of the chorus in Shakespeare's play Henry V? How does the chorus alter our interpretation of the events presented in the play? We're actually going to talk a bit about this when we go through the lectures on Henry V. So it's an interesting topic in terms of how this chorus that introduces each of the acts, how it, let's say, misrepresents to some extent the events that are about to happen in that act. So it's given rise to different ways of interpreting what's going on there. Shakespeare's play Henry V juxtaposes scenes with English and French aristocracy with English common soldiers. What are some of the effects of this juxtaposition, and how does it affect our interpretation of the ultimate meaning of the play? So that one more of a kind of social political angle on the play. Are there any questions about again, raise your hand or come off mute if you have any questions about the assignment as described there, the topics?
It looks cool.
Melody, thank you. So now, can people see a different document now that has a header research?
Yeah, research then create PDF.
Okay, great. So this is the next tool I want to talk about is, so the first steps of making this research essay, and I'll go through this rather than just pointing you to it because it bears thinking through, and it takes a lifetime to perfect this, and Lord knows that I haven't perfected it myself yet, but so there's that aspect of it, but there's also the aspect of it that this is not just for researching English papers or something like that, right? That these approaches are generally applicable to university level research assignments in most disciplines, so the actual format of the output, the research output will be different, that format will be different. But the general direction of needing to dive into a topic and gain more specific knowledge of it, and then communicate it in a convincing way, backing up your points with evidence, that's the general nature of the game, okay, in any discipline you're working in. So I start off with some, if I would say here, in terms of thinking about your research, we can think about it broadly as, humans since the beginning have always had this desire to know. I want to know about all things, like all beings as a whole. I'd like to know everything. So to know everything, you have to break it up into parts. You can't just go about knowing everything. To understand the whole, we have to understand the parts of the whole. And so academic disciplines, we could say, have arisen as a way of increasingly trying to divide up that pie into manageable slices that we can digest, that humans can digest in a lifetime, so to speak. And so research and analysis, that's a first part of this research, research, think, write. So we have to do the research first, then we have to do some thinking, and then we'll do the writing. So the research and analysis is that first part, and it's about diving into that topic and trying to narrow down that slice so that there's a pinpoint that maybe you know more than 99.99% of the people in the world on that topic. Okay. And if you go on to graduate studies and you do a master's thesis or a dissertation, it'll get to the point where you know more than anyone in the world on that topic. You've narrowed it down to a point where you know more than anyone in the world on that topic, and you've kind of advanced knowledge on a very narrow, small point. Okay. And so the research part and analysis part is about gathering and assessing evidence about that narrow sliver of knowledge. And in humanities courses, what we're going to be analyzing primarily in all humanities courses are textual forms of evidence that we're going to be analyzing and researching. So in most of those humanity courses, we distinguish between primary texts and secondary texts. So the primary text can be literary, historical, artistic, philosophical, whatever the text is that's under investigation. And then you've got secondary texts, which are interpretations of that text by scholars that have come before us. So I have some examples of what a primary text could be. Maybe in history class, it's a social reform movement you're studying, and the primary text that you're assessing might be documentary evidence you've unearthed from archives or databases behind that social movement. And then in visual arts class, maybe it's a painting by Van Gogh. In philosophy class, maybe it's a particular work by Kant. In religion class or theology class, maybe it's a sermon by Martin Luther. And then in literature class, maybe it's a poem by John Milton, or in your case, maybe it's a play by William Shakespeare, right? So that's your primary text. And the secondary texts are going to be scholarly articles, books that attempt to interpret those primary texts. So we have a primary text, and we have a tradition of interpretation, like a history of interpretation, that are filtering our access to that primary text. So we have to go through and weigh and assess other interpretations and arguments. So sometimes I'll get a question, so okay, where do I find these secondary texts that you want me to look at? I'll get 3 exactly, and where do I get them? So it's good, well, for this course and for all your courses, to be very familiar with the search tools on the university library there. So hopefully this is not new to anyone here, but I have a link there to the search function at the U of O library, which is I find extremely handy. It's gotten more and more handy over the years. And you can either go down to one of the particular databases or stay at the level that they call Omni. So it's searches all of them. And for this assignment, if I were you, I would do some sort of advanced search function. The example I gave here was Milton, and if people were doing something on Milton's Satan in Paradise Lost, they might want to use those types of fields. But if you're doing Henry V, maybe you want to have probably Henry V in the title. That's because there's thousands and thousands of articles on Shakespeare, right? So Shakespeare is, you will not be the first person to write on Shakespeare, right? So you have to really be able to winnow that down. So get something maybe with Henry V in the title, maybe, military leader or something like that, if you're going on that topic. If you just did Henry V and war, like war in all fields, you'd get probably hundreds. So you're going to have to narrow it down a bit. So now the critical thinking part is next. So you've done some research. You've assessed different interpretations. You've assessed the primary text. So we have to critically assess what we've looked at. So we have to be able to assess various forms of evidence and determine their validity and significance for the question that's under issue. Okay. And for our purposes, the primary source of evidence is textual. So our method of thinking and assessment is basically interpretive. So it's a hermeneutic, a fancy word for interpretive. So whether it's the humanities though, or other social sciences or natural sciences, the critical thinking element that's operative here is understanding the question you're asking. Okay, start with your question. What am I asking? What am I inquiring? Whether it's into nature, a natural object I'm studying in the natural sciences, what is my question to it? How am I probing it? And here we're probing Henry V. What is Shakespeare saying about war? That's my question. So I have to get some evidence, and I'm getting other interpretations, and I'm going to assess those sources of evidence with respect to how it sheds light on that question. So, for instance, while exploring the question, is Satan a hero in Paradise Lost, we might ask ourselves, what are the traditional conceptions of heroism? Are these conceptions static over time, etc.? So we really have to probe the question, make sure we understand the question, first of all, understand how different perspectives and different sources of information are going to shed light on different aspects of the question. So understanding, so that's the questioning part, and then understanding, maybe you come to some sort of, you've read so much, you've come to some sort of understanding about the play that you didn't know before and about the question that you didn't know before. You've posed yourself these questions, you undertook some research and analysis of the topic, leads to a deeper understanding, making connections between issues and sources of data or evidence. And you want to undertake an analysis of these points of data and evidence. You don't want to just rest there with what you've been fed. You want to, even if you feel like you understand the play a bit better, you understand the question a bit better, you want to be able to take apart and analyze the data and the evidence that from which you've already made some connections. So are the connections that were discovered, for instance, significant? Is it a causal connection? Like, is it a significant connection? Is it something that causal in the sense, is it determinative? If we're talking about a work of literature, it's not as though we're talking about Newtonian causes that this formed this, right? Is it determinative in terms of the meaning of the work? Or if you're in the social sciences, is this a significant correlation of two data points that you've been able to assess? Are there certain types of evidence that shed light on or nullify other types of evidence? If so-and-so, you've read this secondary source that says the play's really all about this, and then you've looked at the text and you want to point out that another quote or another section seems to say the opposite, and that's supported by another secondary source as well, and you can say, okay, well, I can maybe put that one aside for now because I really side with this because I think it explains and accounts for the claim made by the other interpretation. And there's different ways. I didn't go through any of them, but there's different ways of trying to visualize that. And I think I kind of joke about how in my lectures I like to I think it helps us understand things if we try to visualize it some ways, put charts around it, but try to do that with your own thinking about the different topics in the play as well, or whatever topic you're researching for other classes as well. And then comes a point where you want to synthesize everything. So you've done the research, you've you've really honed the question. What are the dimensions of the question that I'm asking? I've analyzed the evidence. I've broken it down. I've seen where they're contradictory and how I can tear them apart. And now it's time for a synthesis to bring things together into a larger whole. So you can try to make decisions and conclusions as to the meaning of the evidence that you've garnered and how it answers your original questions. And part of the thing about the coming to the synthesis too is to try to step back. Remember I said that the original point of departure was we're inquiring humans out in the world and we want to know lots of things. And we ended up going into little rabbit holes of specialization. And sometimes we can forget, and academics are the worst at this, forgetting why we jumped down this rabbit hole in the first place. Okay, so why did we jump down there? So we had some time to take a step back and say, why is that? Why does anyone care? Why do I care about whether or not this particular scene in Shakespeare's Henry V depicts war as this? Well, maybe it's going to help us understand the play as a whole better. And then, and the play itself has significant things to say about all humans in all times and how they confront a perennial topic such as war. So we're going back, we're bringing the evidence together, but we're also taking a step back to talk about the significance in relationship to the broader work as a whole, to the mode of inquiry as a whole. So writing the academic essay, so you've done the research part, you've done the thinking part, and now it's the writing part. So I think the key thing to keep in mind for the writing part is it's a form of persuasion. So you want to convince the audience that your particular assessment of the evidence and the way it sheds light on a particular answer to the question that you first posed is the proper interpretation, the proper answer to that question. So you're going to have to make, particular claims, support it with arguments, support those arguments with evidence, and make sure that they're those steps are logically laid out. And it's going to have to be written in a style and with mechanics that people can understand. So those are the 5 elements that I highlighted this part of the document, and they're the 5 elements of the grading rubric that's used for this assignment and for the final exam. So this document goes into a bit more depth onto those 5 elements. And I have a question from Sophia in the chat. Regarding the final exam, the exam schedule says that our exam is April 22nd. Is our exam available just for that day to complete, or will it be available before that day? I will make it available before that day. That's a very good question. And thanks for telling me it's the 22nd, because I had not seen that. And I will confirm that for everyone. Just making a note to myself. But obviously no one has to show up or anything like that. You'll have a window to submit your final exam on the 22nd. There'll be a deadline for that, but I'm gonna post the final exam before that. It'll be more like a take-home exam for this class, and you'll have a chance to basically get working on that before then. Okay. Caleb, do I see a hand?
Yes, Professor. So in regards to the exam, when you post it the day before, the 22nd, is it that we can open the exam, work on it, and then close it and come back to it later, or do we have to like finish it the minute we open it?
No, you can open it, come back to it later. There's no time limit there. So it's in the syllabus. The 2 questions are in the syllabus now. It's just a matter of, I have to plug in a couple quotes. So you basically know what you're going to be asked. you're going to be asked a question on Homer or Virgil where you have to place the quote and talk about the significance. And then you're going to have a question on Virginia Woolf, on a secondary source on Virginia Woolf, and you're going to have to agree or disagree with that. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Is there any other comments? Good questions, everyone. And if you have those questions, I'm sure others do as well. So do ask if you have them. And thanks for stepping up, Sophia and Caleb. Okay, so we talked a bit about the research process, the thinking process that goes ahead of the writing. And my joke sometimes is people go, are probably thinking to themselves in today's day and age, Professor Wilson, I don't have to go through all those steps. I just download my essay from the essay writing website, or I download it from some plagiarism site. Of course, it goes without saying, I'm discouraging plagiarism. Please do not do that. So the assumption is that you've done the research, you've done the thinking, and you're going to write your own essay, okay? So you've done the research, you've done the thinking, now the writing. So we said that you need to have a clear thesis, a point you're trying to make, need to have arguments with evidence. They need your construction of those arguments and how you're telling that story has to be logical and has to have a logical organization. It has to be written in a style that is readable. The mechanics have to be there so that can be understood. By mechanics, I mean basics of grammar and diction. So what is a strong thesis? And this is it's my attempt to try to explain this. Maybe you've had different attempts at this, but try to take what you can from other attempts as well as this one. As I mentioned, academic writing, you're trying to persuade someone. And persuading is something we do all the time, right? We're trying to persuade, I've got examples there. Maybe you're trying to persuade coworkers that your plan is a good one. Maybe you're trying to persuade friends that your favorite film's the best film in the history of film, what have you. So the academic argument is similar to these types of persuasion, but it follows a fairly predictable pattern. Okay, so now a lab report in various sciences will have a slightly different format than this, but the essence is the same, basically, right? So think of the thesis as the hypothesis, and then the arguments as observations, what have you, right? And then the logic is the same about proving a point and backing it up with evidence. And then the other important aspects of having it logical, having it readable in terms of its style and diction are also equally important. So generally, especially in the humanities, it will have the predictable pattern will be a kind of a brief introductory paragraph of the topic that gets people situated in the general topic, where you state your point of view in a pithy, often in one sentence, claim that you will prove. And let's call that the thesis statement. And that's going to be guiding the rest of the paper. And then what is this thesis statement doing? It tells the reader how you will interpret the significance of the subject matter. It lays out the design of the paper. So ideally, in the thesis statement or around it, you're also outlining the kind of the steps you're going to take to demonstrate that thesis. It makes a claim that others might dispute. And it's usually, as I said, for a short essay, for these types of papers, it's usually one sentence. Now, if you're writing a book, or like I said, in graduate studies later, I remember my dissertation was it was a long dissertation, and the actual thesis, let's say the where I was trying to articulate the point I was trying to prove, and how I was going to prove it was, I think, 20 pages long. You're going through it and you're unpacking different parts of a thesis, so to speak. But here, you know, we're looking at a 5-page paper. You should be able to get it into a sentence or so. Now, what's in a good thesis statement? So this is so important, and this is why I stress it so much. Like, I've seen a lot of first-year papers, and this is not thinking through this thesis part is where I would say 80% of them go awry. Because, well, I'll give a couple of examples, but often it's because the thesis is way too broad. You know, Shakespeare's play Henry V is about, you know, about war, you know, or something like that. And then, okay, so first of all, it's way too broad. It's obvious. It's not controversial. So I'm going to go through some of the attributes you need there. First of all, it's argumentative. So it makes a particular case for a particular interpretation. It's not the exploration of a topic. So an example of a topic would be the following essay will discuss the notion of sin in book 9 of Milton's Paradise Lost, which is fine. It's something that you'd see, let's say, in a Cole's notes, you know, kind of notes on Paradise Lost, but it's not a thesis in terms of making an argumentative claim. And then the next one's, let's say, a better example of one that makes an argument. So the following essay will demonstrate that in book 9 of Paradise Lost, Milton presents sin as a type of turning away from God. So you're making a claim about what's going on with sin there. So the other thing about a good thesis statement is it's controversial. It should be something that it should be possible for a reasonable person to disagree with the thesis. So otherwise, if it's stating the obvious, it's making no claim on the reader's attention, and it's not contributing to remember that pointy sliver of knowledge that we're trying to direct forward. If you're claiming the obvious, you haven't pushed that pointy stick of knowledge beyond the sphere of the known yet. So the example I used there is the Henry V is a play about war. Yeah, it is. I know that. Okay. First of all, you know, why do I want to read further? And second of all, you haven't contributed anything to the discussion. Is analytical not evaluative? Okay, so it should introduce, let's say, an analysis. So an analysis breaks apart into components, the literary work, not placing praise or blame on the work. So the latter is the work of a book review. So an example of an evaluative statement would be William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying is a masterful expression of human angst. And I agree, it is. It's a great book. But we haven't said anything about the book. We've just said you really like it. Okay. So an example of an analytical thesis would be William Faulkner's As I Lay Dying uses innovative narrative techniques in order to disorient the reader, not providing a stable narrative identity with whom the reader can identify. This narrative disorientation is a means Faulkner uses for representing modern angst. So there it's analytical because you said, okay, I think Faulkner's trying to represent modern angst, and this is how I think it's happening. This is how he does it. So I've taken apart the machinery a bit to show us so we understand the work a bit more. So this is what separates, let's say, an academic analysis of a work from a book club appreciation. So you go to Oprah's book club and you say, do people know Oprah still? Because Oprah used to have a book club, but you go to a book club and people say, oh, I really like this part. That's great. And that's fine. That's great. That's great. That's reading for pleasure. And that's just letting it pass over. And then what this exercise is about is trying to understand what's happening. Let's take apart the work so we understand what's the machinery of the work. How is that? Why does that have the effect on the reader? How does it relate to other literature in that way? Okay, so we're trying to understand what's going on. Just as, let's say, if you're in the natural sciences, someone can go out in the forest and say, I really love these trees. These are beautiful trees. I love being in nature. The botanist also loves being in nature, but they do in a different way because they like being there, and also because while being there with the trees and with the plants that they are studying, they also have a profound understanding of the mechanisms at work in those plants, how they reproduce, what makes them tick, and why they may have a pleasant effect on a passerby, those types of things. So that's, I guess, we would distinguish what you need to do in an academic essay on a literary work as opposed to the book club appreciation of a work. So next, the thesis has to be about the text, not the world. It has to be about, it should shed light on the literary work and not extrapolate generalizations concerning the world at large, okay? So this is another danger I see in first-year essays that are trying to look at literature. I'm not sure. I think part of it comes from, I don't know much about the Henry V because I hardly read it. I skimmed it, or I didn't read it at all. I read something on Wikipedia about it. So I'm trying to really figure this out, you know, and I know no one in this class is going to do this. I'm just talking about people in my previous classes who wrote papers for me. But so they're trying to fill it out with, oh, it just reminds me of Ukraine and Russia now with war and stuff like that. Okay, so that is not advancing knowledge of anything. That is not advancing knowledge of the work. And your essay was not about Ukraine and Russia, and not that that's not a valid object of study in a different exercise. It's obviously a valid object of study. It's a grave situation that's going on that needs to be understood. But here we need to understand Henry V. And then here's maybe the most important thing. It's got to be specific. It's got to address a very narrowly defined topic. So examples of theses that are too broad are Shakespeare's sonnets are all about love. So it's way too broad. So it's too broad in two senses. The scope is too broad. It's looking at Shakespeare, all of Shakespeare's sonnets. So you could write a whole book, could write several books on Shakespeare's sonnets, but you've only got 5 pages. There's no way you're going to talk about each one of Shakespeare's sonnets, okay? So there's 150 sonnets, if I recall correctly, 154 sonnets. So the same with Henry IV. You want to say there's a whole play there, it's a big play. So somewhere in that thesis, or at least how you're going to narrow in on that thesis, you've got to be, you're not talking about the whole play. You're going to be talking about an aspect of the play, maybe a scene in the play. Maybe that's one way of narrowing it down. Another example here, Plato's allegory of the cave deals with education. So again, it's too broad. So Shakespeare's sonnets are all about love. I was saying the scope is too broad and the topic is too broad. So we haven't said, okay, what aspect of love are we talking about? There's a million aspects of love. Again, the equivalent for our assignment would be Shakespeare's Henry V is about war. So there's a lot of problems. It's obvious it is about war. Yeah, we know that. It's way too broad. You're going to talk about every aspect of the play, the whole play that has any reference to war. Is that what you're going to tell us about? And war. Well, what aspect of the war? It's the detrimental effect war has on people, leadership in war, the significance people can take for their personal lives from it, those types of things. So you really have to narrow down the scope, like what you're going to look at, as well as the dimension of the topic you're going to address. Okay, so here's some examples of both the lead-up material. And these are from previous essays. They're anonymous, though. I'm not calling anyone out here or praising anyone. So examples of superfluous introductory material. So try to avoid superfluous introductory material. Everything's got to be tight. You've got only a few pages. It's got to be tight so that the first introductory material is leading to your thesis. It's talking about your topic in such a way that you're narrowing in on your thesis. So here are some examples of sometimes you get kind of superfluous material that's not adding to that. I like this one. Plato's Republic is a piece of literature. I like that. That's a good phrase. Studied in many fields of learning in current society and still has much to teach us today. Or Plato was a great philosopher who studied with Socrates in classical Greece. So this gets me to another question I sometimes get is, you know, if I was telling my 7-year-old son, you know, I might even start further back, but assume your audience here, the audience you're assuming here is an educated university level person who's read the work. Okay, so that's what you're assuming. Okay, so if someone's writing an article on Henry V, they don't start with who Shakespeare is. Shakespeare was a poet, playwright of 16th, 17th century England, and he wrote 36 plays, maybe 37. And he also did, they don't start with a biography. They don't do a plot summary of Henry V. So they assume that person is educated, knows who Shakespeare is. They assume that person knows what goes on in Henry V, has read it. If not recently, they at least know what's going on there because they've got that in the back of their cultural memory. So too here for your essay. Okay, so here would be an example of a good a good thesis statement with although certain aspect of it could be improved. I took this, as I said, from a student. The thesis, it could be improved in terms of its clarity of concept. The truth, like the sun after one has been staying in the darkness, hurts. Thus, those who see the truth and stay with it are rare. And when they try to bring it to the masses, will be fought and sometimes persecuted for disrupting the order, even though the order is based on falsehood. The implications for the ethical and political teachings of the allegory are that we must recognize our false reality, choose to view the truth, and continue to do so regardless of exterior pressures. Okay, so we have a good question here that's already been answered by Melody. Is this document posted on Brightspace? And as Melody answered and has put the link there for us, thank you. It's already up on the website. Thank you. So a hypothetical example of a not so good thesis statement. So it's too vague and obvious. The allegory of the cave shows us the importance of education and how this education can make the world better. So really broad, very vague, you know, and kind of obvious. So it's saying that the allegory of the cave is about education. Okay, so that's the thesis. So I've really droned on about the thesis, I know, but as I said, if you get that part right, that's the first big hurdle. So get that part right, and avoid some of those tricks we just talked about, or some of those traps. Next, we have to think about the arguments that are connected to the thesis and how they are going to support your thesis. So each paragraph, think of each paragraph as having a clear idea or argument that it's asserting. So each paragraph should almost be its own little entity and should be able to stand on its own as an idea and as an argument. And it should be very clear from the first sentence how it's linked to the thesis. Okay, so right off the bat, when I'm reading that first sentence, it has to be clear why I'm reading that sentence. Why am I reading the sentence? What has this got to do with, what's it got to do with what you just talked about in terms of your thesis? Okay. Now, these arguments, what are these arguments and what are they not? So the arguments are not plot summaries. This is the number, when it comes to arguments, this is, I remember I talked about a lot of the traps for theses that I've seen. When it comes to arguments, the biggest by far, 99%, of the traps I see when it comes to people making arguments is they mistake plot summary for an argument. Okay, so plot summary is not an argument. So here's an example of someone writing about Plato's cave, thinking they're making an argument, but they're just summarizing the cave. So when one of the prisoners is freed and let out of the cave for the first time, he must adjust to the brighter light outside the cave. Once this adjustment takes place, he is able to see the world as it really is. He then returns to the cave to bring this new knowledge back, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So the arguments need to be points that or ideas that one is making that support an argumentative or controversial thesis that someone is making. So if I'm saying that, let's say Henry V is a great military leader, is a great leader, period, let's say, for Shakespeare, and I'm going to do it by looking at one particular episode, and I'm going to look at leadership in this way. So I need to confront different other arguments. So he seems in sometimes to be really cruel. Okay, well, sometimes people see it's cruel. However, this is also the way he does it. It's also a sign of great leadership because he does this, 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 and this. That's idea one, right? And then, or argument one. And then argument two is how he shows mercy with those at Harfleur or whatever, and you show the evidence to support that. So that's the next point I want to get to is the arguments need evidence to back them up. Okay, so when it comes to evidence, the biggest thing I see is people don't have evidence. They do not show evidence. Okay. Now I try to think of what you're doing here as you're a defense attorney. So I love this analogy. Okay. So the thesis in your case, so your thesis is kind of like the defense attorney saying, my client is innocent. Okay. Now your argument, maybe your first argument is she could not have committed the murder because she was out of town that day. So a good defense attorney is going to have several arguments that they make. They're going to have character witnesses. They're going to have, she couldn't have done it because she's an upstanding person of the community. And my evidence, I've got these character witnesses to back me up. Argument two, she didn't even have opportunity to commit the murder because she was out of town that day. Evidence, I've got eyewitness accounts of her presence elsewhere. I've got travel receipts. I've got GPS cell phone data. Okay, so if I'm a good defense attorney, I've got a very clear thesis. Defense attorneys really thesis is really clear. My client's innocent. You can't get a clearer thesis, right? And then you've got a very clear argument that's logically connected to it. Okay, why do I think that my client's innocent? Because they weren't even there. And then they've got evidence. So in our case, it's going to be citations from the primary text. It's going to be citations from secondary texts that, let's say, corroborate with you, or that you're let's say, dismissing their arguments very plainly. So logical organizations and connections. So within the paragraphs, it's important to ensure that it's clear to the reader how the idea or argument of the paragraph connects to the thesis, and how the evidence connects or reinforces that argument. So that's all part of the logical connections, right? So in my example of my client was innocent, the connections are really clear because it's something we understand. It's something we heard in courtroom dramas a million times, but we don't often hear arguments around a play. So we have to make sure when you read it, it's very clear that an uninformed jury, let's say, or a jury of your peers that knows, as I said, is they're not uninformed, they're university educated and they know Shakespeare, but they don't know what path you've gone down, that they will clearly understand the point you're making with respect to how that evidence supports your argument, how that argument supports your thesis. And make sure that there's logical connections between the paragraphs. And for both of those, I think that the best trick I would point you to is really trying to think about, do I need to use any of these joining words, let's call them here? that help to clarify logical connections. So conjunctive adverbs such as however, moreover, therefore, and coordinating conjunctions, and, but, or, not. So the function of these types of words are to show a logical relationship to that which has gone before, right? Is to guide the reader for how your next sentence will either depart, however, even though this is the case, even though the evidence seems to say this, however, I think this is happening. So the actual, in that case, the conjunctive adverb almost puts a little connecting thread visually there between the two clauses. Okay, so those are the first three elements that we're talking about in our grading rubric: thesis, argument and evidence, logical connections. Style, we can't really go over that, in terms of how to write sentences that are clear yet variable, that attract a reader's attention, that have a certain rhythm to them. I think that comes with time and with just practice writing and reading. And I have kind of a list of great prose authors, including Virginia Woolf, who we'll be reading as later in the course. And then for the mechanics, I'll refer you again to the English Department Style Guide in terms of spelling, grammar, punctuation, and how to cite properly. And then finally, in terms of two tools that people are free to use at the university, is the Faculty of Arts Writing Center and the Student Academics Success Services Writing Help Center as well. So there's two links there. They perform similar functions. I've heard good things about the Faculty of Arts one. I've heard that they're very useful, that they'll go through and help you kind of edit a paper. Okay, so that is an overview of some tips and tricks for the research essay assignment. Any questions, any final questions or comments? Are we all jazzed to go write about Henry V? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it is a good reminder of stuff.
Good.
'Cause, yeah, now I'm realizing I did a lot of mistakes in my previous papers.
Oh, yeah,
No.
yeah. Well, like I said, there's nothing near perfection in this. Nobody's perfect on this, and it could take a lifetime to try to work on these skills. So definitely try to work on it and try to think about it again. It's the other key point that I would say is, and I understand what's like, right? I was an undergrad too. It was a long time ago, but I still remember, I always had good intentions, right? Oh yeah, that's what I'll do, right? I'll get to the library. I'll start a couple weeks in advance. And then, yeah, and I'll leave lots of time, but that is a big ingredient. I talked about the mechanics and stuff like that, but the process is leaving time so that you can, that is so key, so that you can have the time for that thinking and pulling together that thesis. But the other big one is having enough time that you get a really rough draft out there and get it typed out. Give yourself some distance from it and be able to read it after, half a day or a day later, so you can read it and realize, oh wait, that doesn't make sense. When I was talking about those logical connections,
Yeah.
a lot of times it makes sense when you're writing it in the thick of it, but when you read it a day later, oh, okay, that makes absolutely no sense. There's no logical connection between those two. I have to use one of Professor Wilson's joining words there to make the link, or I have to reword it otherwise. So if you can at all, try to build in the time for it. That will help. We have about a month. It's due March 25th. So do try to build that in. And anything else?
I mean, that was a pretty helpful tip, so thanks.
Thank you, Melody. Thanks, everyone.
Question, sorry, Professor.
Yeah, Caleb.
You cut out about the March 4th thing. What is due on March 4th, may I ask?
I'm not sure what I was saying, but nothing's due on March 4th. March 25th, the essay is due. So we have about a month.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, good question. All right, everyone. So our next lecture is the Wednesday night lectures is already recorded. It's an introduction to the modern era and how we're shifting from the ancient authors to the modern era. And then the next time we'll see each other face to face next Monday, we'll have, I think it's an introduction to Shakespeare. Okay. Have a great week.
Have a great week. Looking forward
Thank you,
to it.
Professor.
Thank you, Professor.